Greetings and welcome to Behavioral Ecology. After finishing this video, you should be able to explain fixed action patterns. You should also be able to describe examples of learning in animals, as well as the optimal foraging theory. You should be able to distinguish between piloting, orientation, and navigation, and describe some of the ways in which animals communicate with each other. And lastly, you should be able to explain the concept of inclusive fitness and its role in understanding altruistic behaviors. So let's begin with a few genetically based, instinctive, innate behaviors. For example, fixed action patterns. These are essentially behaviors that are often triggered by specific cues in different species of animals. As a few examples, if you look at fish, the stickleback fish that you see toward the left here, males tend to have this red patch on the underside of their bodies. And if a male fish detects another male fish entering its territory, it will instinctively initiate a defensive behavior and try to chase that other male away. And we can trigger that behavior even if we use plastic models that really don't look very realistic. But as long as those models have that red patch on the bottom side, that's enough to trigger an actual stickleback to initiate that defensive behavior. If you introduce a model that's pretty lifelike but yet lacks that red coloration on the underside, that simply will not initiate that behavior. So in that case, the trigger is that red patch on the underside of the organism, and of course the behavior then is the defensive response. We can see the same type of thing happening in various birds as well. Here we see European robins, illustrating that same type of impact with males trying to chase away other males, as long as they have that orange patch of feathers that we see on the underside here. Just as another example, we see moths. Many species of moths, if they're flying around at night and if they detect that they are being echolocated by a bat, they will instinctively do evasive flight maneuvers in an attempt, of course, to prevent being eaten by the bat. So again, these are all innate behaviors triggered by specific cues. And we think about these behaviors, we can sort of think about questions at two levels. So first of all, what is it that actually triggers those behavior responses? And furthermore, why do they happen? What are the evolutionary selective pressures that led to the evolution of those types of behaviors? So when we think about questions at these two levels here, we're really talking about proximate cause versus ultimate causation. So proximate cause referring to what is it that triggers a behavior response, and ultimate causation referring to why does it happen? What led to the evolution of those types of behaviors? In addition to genetically based behaviors, of course, many behaviors are learned. So many animals can, of course, learn. Just a few examples of learning in animals. Imprinting. Many species of birds in particular can imprint. And this is a brief period of time during early development where birds of certain species will imprint on whatever they happen to be associated with at that point in time. Typically, it's for example, mama bird, but it doesn't have to be. Here we see Konrad Lorenz doing some experiments on imprinting where essentially these birds have imprinted on him and they sort of follow him everywhere, again, as if he were sort of mama bird. There's also this idea of classical conditioning. So you might have heard of Pavlov's dogs, sort of a common example illustrating classical conditioning. And essentially what we're talking about here is animals that can associate some cue, and then perhaps ringing a bell with some other activity, perhaps being fed. So this is an example of associative learning. So for example, it doesn't take long if you feed a dog and if you happen to ring a bell. Every time you feed him, he will then learn to associate the ringing of the bell with being fed. And so it doesn't take long. You can just ring the bell and the dog will come running and he'll start to salivate because, of course, he learns to anticipate being fed, right? That's a very common and easily observable type of learning. You may have also heard of operant conditioning, kind of a similar situation, but this is where we're essentially trying to teach animals certain things by using rewards or punishment. So a little different than classical conditioning, but somewhat similar nonetheless. And if you think about ultimately, are animals able to think? Can they solve problems? There's actually lots of good examples of animals thinking. This is just one example. You see a chimp here. We've got some fruit suspended from the ceiling. The chimp can't reach the fruit, but he figures out pretty easily that if he stacks these crates up, well, then he can reach the fruit and, of course, solve his problem. So lots of other examples, of course, of animals that are capable of fairly complex thinking skills. Some of the basic questions or things that all species of animals have to sort of deal with or contend with as part of their existence would include things like, well, what do they eat and how much energy should they expend in finding their food? So one common observation is that animals tend to try and maximize their calories, their nutrients, the energy that they obtain from their food relative to the amount of energy that they expend finding that food. So this is the idea of the optimal foraging theory. So that's illustrated here. So for example, you have these birds living in these nests on the side of this cliff here, and the birds can fly away and bring back various insects and feed their young. And this, if you look at this graph on here, this essentially shows that the farther these birds fly away from their nest, the more insects they bring back to the nest. And so if you think about it, that should make intuitive sense. So the farther away you have to fly, that takes a lot of energy. In order to make it worth your while, you have to be able to bring back a fair amount of food. So this is, again, illustrating this idea of optimizing or maximizing the food that you are able to acquire relative to the energy that you spend acquiring that food. So that's, again, the optimal foraging theory. Another basic question is how do animals decide who to mate with? Well, there are all sorts of studies that look at various aspects of mate choice. So quite often there's a lot of selection going on. For example, here we see a peacock displaying his beautiful feathers here, all in an attempt to convince the female to mate with him. So will this female decide that he's worth mating with? Well, it depends, right? But she can sort of make that choice whether or not she decides to mate with him or not. So that's a common phenomenon in many species of animals. And another really interesting phenomenon deals with animal movements, especially if you think about long distance travel, like, for example, long distance migrations. How do animals know where to go? Well, it turns out various species of animals can use a variety of cues to figure out where they need to go. So, a few basic concepts to think about. First of all, this idea of piloting. What this refers to is the idea that many animals use visual cues to navigate where they're trying to go. So, just as one example, various wasps build their nests in the ground, and they might fly away from the nest for a while and do various things, but then they somehow can always find their way back to the nest. Well, it turns out that they use a lot of visual cues. It could be trees nearby or lots of other things, but they use those visual cues in order to navigate back to the nest. In addition, if you think about more long distance travel, a lot of animals have the ability to detect direction, north, south, east, and west. So that's the idea of orientation. So a lot of animals that migrate, whether it be birds or fish or sea turtles, they have this innate ability to detect north, south, east, and west. And again, use that in part as a cue to finding their way when they're traveling long distances. But true navigation is kind of combines various aspects of piloting and orientation. This is essentially the concept that many animals have an innate ability to know where they need to go relative to where they are currently located. And often this is reinforced in animals that have made long distance journeys before. But again, true navigation is a common feature of many species, and it really gives them this intriguing ability to to know how to get to where they want to get to. So again, just some of the factors involved in animal movement and migration. There are, of course, also various ways that animals can communicate with each other. So, just as a few examples, fireflies or lightning bugs. Often you see these flashing at night in the summertime, perhaps. And what are they doing? Well, they're actually communicating with other fireflies in an attempt to find potential mates. Mammals, of course, use a variety of ways of communicating. Sometimes it might be scent or sound, or even body language. Again, just a few examples of how mammals can communicate with other mammals. Birds, often they communicate with loud noises, or coloration of their feathers, right? Various communication mechanisms going on there. Some animals even rely on pheromones. These are similar to hormones, but they're released from organisms and have an effect on some other organisms. So, for example, if you've seen a trail of ants, like we see here, often those ants are following a pheromone trail left down by an initial ant who found a source of food and then made its way back to the colony so that other ants could then go and find that source of food. Moths, for example, can detect very small amounts of pheromones, and they can then travel toward the source of the pheromone to find potential mates. And it turns out there's actually some evidence that humans may, in fact, produce and respond to pheromones as well. So lots of interesting communication going on in animals that rely on pheromones. Bees, these are fascinating insects. Bees can communicate with other bees in a hive the presence of a good source of food by using either the round or waggle dance. So let's say a bee flies away and finds a good source of food fairly close to the beehive. It might then fly back to the hive and do a so-called round dance. This essentially communicates to other bees in the hive that, hey, there's a source of food nearby. You can just fly away, don't have to go very far, and you're probably going to find it. Or if the source of food is a little farther away, the bee can fly back and do the so-called waggle dance like we see here. So it's basically a figure eight, and the bee can sort of vibrate its abdomen. If it does so moving directly upward like we see here, that communicates to the other bees to fly directly toward the sun. If it vibrates its abdomen in a downward direction like we see here, that tells the other bees fly directly away from the sun. Or it can even do so at an angle, like we see here. And again, telling the other bees to fly at this angle away from the sun. And again, that's where you're likely to find a good source of food. So a lot of elaborate, complex communication going on in beehives. There are some behaviors, altruistic behaviors, for example, um, that are kind of difficult to explain, at least at first glance. So when we talk about altruistic behaviors, often these are behaviors that can lead to an organism putting itself at risk, potentially even leading to its death. But often this results in that organism helping closely related individuals survive. So, for example, prairie dogs, if they detect that there's a predator nearby, often they will emit this sort of chirping call. And that tells other prairie dogs, hey, be careful, there's a predator nearby. Now, it turns out that puts that initial prairie dog more at risk of being eaten by the predator. So, why would this behavior evolve? Why would the prairie dog be willing to put itself at risk just to warn others? Well, it turns out we often observe that prairie dogs are willing to do this if it means saving closely related individuals. Likewise, if you think about bees, often if a bee stings you or something else, that bee is likely to die. So why would that behavior evolve? Again, it it's sort of counterintuitive at first glance. Behaviors that result in the death of an organism doesn't make much sense, but it makes much more sense when you think about the idea of inclusive fitness. And it goes something like this. Um, you yourself can pass on your alleles uh, in a couple of different ways. For example, you can have kids, right? You can have your own offspring. That would result in your alleles being passed on to future generations. But also think about if you happen to have a sibling, and if they have kids or they have offspring, you and your sibling share some alleles. If your sibling has kids, their offspring will also share some of your alleles. So, anytime you have a situation where closely related individuals are benefited or helped by various behaviors, even if it means putting oneself at risk, that's an example of inclusive fitness that could be increased even though behaviors might be altruistic. So, in other words, even though behaviors put oneself at risk, as long as it means that closely related individuals are more likely to survive and pass on their offspring, that's yet another way for your alleles to be passed on to future generations. So, that concludes this brief introduction to behavioral ecology.